Mindy, don't go outside. Wait for me to come back. You must wait for me. 3 short sentences appeared on my phone at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. And the vibration against the bedside table felt unnaturally loud in the silence of the apartment, as if it had struck directly against my nerves, rather than the wood beneath it. Welcome to Panda's Storyboard. Put on your headphones, get cozy, and settle in. Let's enjoy this story together. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. Now, let's begin. The sender was Carl, my boyfriend, a man who had never once in 5 years sent me a message without context, explanation, or at least a calming follow-up, and certainly never one that read like a warning torn from the last page of a disaster novel. He was the youngest attending cardiac surgeon at Central Hospital, the kind of person who could walk out of an all-night emergency surgery with blood on his cuffs and still smile gently while saying he was used to it. So seeing words this abrupt, this urgent, instantly made my chest sink, as though something heavy had been placed on it. I had known him since college, through exams, internships, endless shifts, and 1,000 mundane evenings. And no matter how chaotic the world became around him, Carl had always remained steady, rational, and almost stubbornly calm, which made this sudden loss of composure feel more frightening than any explicit explanation could have. My fingers were already shaking when I called him, the screen lighting up my face in the darkness. And when the call failed again and again, until a cold mechanical voice informed me that the number was temporarily unavailable, the last trace of sleep evaporated from my body in an instant. Wrapped in my blanket, I sat motionless on the sofa, staring at the front door as if willing it to open, while the clock on the coffee table continued ticking with merciless precision, each second dragging past like a slow, deliberate countdown. Outside the window, the city slept peacefully, streetlights casting soft halos through the narrow gap in the curtains. But that gentle glow could not reach the unease spreading through my chest, nor could it explain why the quiet suddenly felt oppressive, as though the night itself were holding its breath. At 5:03 a.m., the lock finally turned with hurried, clumsy force, followed by uneven breathing that sounded far too ragged to belong to the man I knew. And before I could even stand, Carl pushed the door open and stumbled inside. His white coat was stained dark in several places, the fabric stiff and creased, as though it had been grabbed, dragged, or pressed against something it should never have touched. And his eyes, usually clear and focused, were bloodshot and rimmed with fear he no longer bothered to hide. He seized my hand the moment he saw me, gripping so tightly that my bones ached, as if letting go for even a second would cause everything to fall apart. And when he spoke, his voice was hoarse and shredded, each word sounding as though it had been scraped from his throat. "There's a zombie virus," he said, forcing the words out slowly, heavily, as if naming it alone made it more real, and then added that patient 0 had already appeared. He told me how the medical conference had collapsed into chaos when a nurse suddenly attacked the doctors beside her, biting with animal violence. How they had first assumed it was a mental breakdown until the bitten began changing right in front of them, and how containment procedures had failed so completely that anyone injured turned into the same thing within minutes. As he spoke, my mind buzzed painfully, my legs giving out as I sank back onto the sofa, because everything he described sounded like scenes stitched together from countless movies. And yet the tremor in his hands and the terror in his eyes made it impossible to dismiss as fiction. Carl crouched in front of me, gripping my shoulders and forcing me to meet his gaze, his expression rigid with the kind of seriousness that left no room for doubt. And he explained that these infected moved at least twice as fast as ordinary people, showed extreme aggression, and reacted only to living targets. He told me how their department head had been bitten in the carotid artery while trying to save a patient, how the man had turned in less than 10 minutes, eyes going completely white, before attacking everyone around him, and how at the current rate of spread, the virus would reach our city in no more than 3 days. When he said we only had 3 days to prepare and that we had to survive, his voice finally wavered, just slightly, enough to reveal the exhaustion and fear he had been holding back since the moment everything went wrong. Professional instinct soon overtook panic, and Carl forced himself to calm down, his breathing steadying as we sat together and rapidly analyzed every possible option, discarding them one by one with ruthless practicality. Staying in a city meant limited supplies, an overwhelming population density, and once the infection surfaced, it would become a sealed cage with no way out, whereas returning to the countryside offered space, resources, and distance from the inevitable chaos. My parents had already retired back to our ancestral home, a place surrounded by fields and farmland with few neighbors and natural defensive advantages. And compared to a concrete jungle filled with millions of people, it was the only reasonable choice. We divided tasks quickly, wasting no time on fear, with me packing warm clothes, common medicines, and important documents, while Carl contacted a rental company for a cargo truck, agreeing to meet at the community gate in half an hour, before heading straight to the market. At 6 in the morning, the city was only half awake, with just a handful of elderly exercisers and sanitation workers on the roads, breakfast stalls beginning to steam gently, as if welcoming another ordinary day, completely unaware of the disaster approaching in silence. We drove directly to the largest vegetable market on the outskirts, knowing supermarkets would not open in time, and were met with shouting vendors and the familiar chaos of early trade, which felt surreal under the weight of what we knew. We went straight for root vegetables, piling potatoes, sweet potatoes, cabbage, corn, yams, and radishes into sacks as if possessed, drawing delighted looks from stall owners who assumed we were stocking for a restaurant rather than preparing for the end of civilization. By the time we finished, the truck was loaded with mountains of durable produce, only a symbolic amount of leafy greens added for early nutrition, and without pausing, we split up to cover more ground. Carl handled grains and meat, while I ran to a nearby 24-hour pharmacy, where the night nurse stared blankly as I swept shelves clean, ordering cold medicine, fever reducers, anti-inflammatories, vitamins, disinfectants, bandages, thermometers, masks, and gloves in quantities that bordered on absurd. I left with bags heavy enough to bruise my hands, knowing that in a world collapsing into infection, these items would mean the difference between life and death. And when the nurse asked if I was opening a clinic, I lied smoothly about a family nursing home and fled before she could question further. Back at the market, Carl was already loading rice, flour, oil, frozen meat, and seafood into the truck, before pointing me toward a seed shop and telling me to buy as many varieties as possible, because survival without renewal was just a slower form of death. I grabbed seeds, blindly, unable to distinguish half of them, stuffing cabbage, tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplants, fruits, and even sunflowers into bags, while the owner laughed and wished me luck with my garden, unaware of how serious that wish truly was. Eggs followed, then durable fruits like apples, lemons, and pomegranates, until by 8 in the morning the truck was more than half full, and yet the news on my phone remained calm and frivolous, filled with gossip and mocked zombie videos dismissed as marketing stunts. Carl explained quietly that the truth was being suppressed to prevent panic, warning that once people realized what was happening, greed would turn roads into dead ends faster than any virus, and that we could only save ourselves and our family. I called my parents immediately, urging them to stock food and water and not leave the house, sending them a list of supplies, and asking my father to reinforce the property, trusting that they would follow instructions without demanding explanations. The rest of the day blurred into frantic movement, as we cleared supermarket shelves of long-lasting food, rented another truck for water, and emptied every store we passed of bottled supplies, barrels, and containers for rain collection. After leaving the highway, Carl stopped the trucks by a hidden roadside, explaining that entering the village in daylight with so many supplies would attract dangerous attention, because in times like these, gossip and greed spread faster than infection. We waited until dusk to return home, slipping quietly into the countryside, where our 5-story ancestral house stood alone among fields, already surrounded by workers my parents had hired without question, transforming it into something closer to a fortress than a home. By the next evening, the walls had been raised and reinforced with steel and concrete, fencing lined with spikes had been installed, the gate replaced, and emergency facilities completed. And as night fell, the house stood silent and solid against the darkness. The apocalypse had already begun somewhere far away, but within those walls, we had done everything we could to be ready. 2 large trucks rolled into the courtyard one after the other, their engines coughing dust into the air, as if even the machines were exhausted by how quickly the world had changed. And when the tarps were pulled back, what spilled into view was not hope exactly, but the raw material of endurance, stacked and categorized with a cold, almost military precision. One truck was filled with daily necessities, clothes thick and thin for every season folded into tight blocks, dozens of bedding sets compressed until they barely resembled fabric, rows of body wash, shampoo, and conditioner, lined up like obedient soldiers, soap, toothpaste, toothbrushes, towels, sanitary pads, toilet paper, laundry detergent, and soap, filling crate after crate, along with kitchen seasonings so complete that even 20 kilograms of scallions, ginger, and garlic, 10 kilograms of dried chili peppers, and 5 kilograms of peppercorns had been accounted for. Items that would not fill our stomachs, but would keep our minds from collapsing under the monotony of survival. The second truck was heavier, darker in purpose, packed with the kind of equipment that acknowledged danger without flinching, including 2 extra-large freezers, a full water purification system, 10 high-capacity power banks, 5 electric cooking pots, 20 solar panels stacked like black glass coffins, 2 hand-crank generators, 3 radios, 2 drones, 2 pairs of binoculars, 500 candles, 50 lighters, boxes of hardware tools, and bundles of steel wire ropes and iron chains that clinked ominously whenever they were moved. Carl pressed a small knife into my palm, its blade thin and viciously sharp, and told me in a low voice to keep it on me at all times and never lose it, because if danger came close enough to touch me, this would be the only line between my pulse and silence. He handed long knives to my parents as well, explaining without embellishment that zombies did not feel pain, that fear and mercy were useless, and that only destroying the head would stop them. Words spoken with the calm certainty of someone who had already seen what happened when hesitation lasted even a second too long. My father weighed the knife in his hand, nodded once, and said evenly that he had been a soldier in his youth, and still remembered how to strike and how to endure, his composure oddly steady in a world that was unraveling by the hour. That night, Carl and my father climbed onto the rooftop and worked without rest, their silhouettes moving against the dark, as they installed the solar panels one by one, knowing that when the power grid failed, and it would, these black rectangles would decide whether we lived in darkness or retained a thin grip on modern life. As they worked, Carl explained that the hand-crank generators were backups for days without sunlight, insurance against long stretches of clouded skies, and that as long as at least one system functioned, we would be able to cook, heat water, and keep our communication devices alive. My mother and I turned the rooftop into farmland, tearing up the tiles that had once supported leisurely afternoons and hauling 30 loads of soil from the backyard, spreading it carefully into evenly divided planting beds, our hands blistered and aching, but steady. She chose fast-growing vegetables, scattering seeds for leafy greens, lettuce, and romaine with practiced movements, then planted neat rows of garlic and scallions, crops that could be harvested within weeks and would keep our bodies from forgetting what fresh food tasted like. Water became the next problem, because cleanliness was not a luxury my mother could abandon even at the end of the world, and using leftover cement and red bricks, we built 2 water storage tanks along the rooftop edge, each capable of holding over 200 liters of rainwater and dew. Beside them, Carl dug and lined a small pond, already planning for fish fry once things stabilized, speaking of future meals with the careful optimism of someone who refused to let the word future disappear from his vocabulary. Rumors were spreading faster than the virus itself, Carl told us. Supermarkets in the city stripped bare, roads choked with stalled cars, panic blooming openly now that silence could no longer contain it. And given the geographic layout, our town could be reached within 3 days at most. The third night arrived too quickly, and before dawn we made our final purchase, this time not of objects, but of living creatures, because survival without renewal was only delayed extinction. At the town market, we bought 50 hens, 20 ducks, 10 rabbits, and a tank of live fish, calculating protein, reproduction rates, and long-term sustainability with the same seriousness others once reserved for mortgages and careers. Feed followed in bulk. 200 kilograms for chickens, 100 for ducks, 50 for rabbits, enough to last months, because starving animals would only become another problem waiting to explode. When we left, the crowd had begun to turn sharp-edged, people abandoning money in favor of fists. An elderly woman knocked to the ground as instant noodles scattered around her like spilled offerings, her crying swallowed by the rising noise. Carl dragged me into the car and sped away. And at the village entrance, loudspeakers crackled to life with an emergency broadcast announcing mutated infected, imminent lockdown, and instructions to seal doors, store supplies, and wait for rescue. Words that sounded orderly, but landed like a match in dry grass. Chaos erupted instantly as villagers poured into the streets, and we barely made it home before locking the gate, hauling supplies upstairs, sealing windows, and drawing blackout curtains until the house felt less like a home and more like a sealed bunker. Exhaustion flattened us. And after eating bread and milk, we fell asleep on the floor, only to wake to a world that no longer bothered pretending. The internet was ablaze with horror. Headlines screaming of unknown viruses and mutated individuals. Videos showing cities drowning in fire and blood. Soldiers overwhelmed. Reporters nearly eaten alive on camera. And when a zombie lunged at the lens mid-broadcast, I threw my phone away in terror. The next morning, screams woke me, and through the one-way glass, I watched a man clutching stolen supplies run for his life. A woman with white eyes and a blood-smeared face, catching him in seconds and tearing into his neck. Blood sprang bright and obscene. I counted without meaning to. Watched him rise again 12 seconds later, with ruined eyes and a severed artery still pumping, and screamed silently as he lunged at others, the sound drawing both monsters straight to our gate. They slammed into it relentlessly, bodies breaking but never stopping, until Carl covered my mouth and reminded me that sound was death, and slowly, painfully, my heartbeat obeyed. We established rules that day. Absolute silence, no injuries, destroy the head, avoid guns, and learned them not as theory, but as law. When Mr. Adams, our neighbor, screamed for help from a tree surrounded by zombies, my father nearly broke the rules himself, and only a desperate plan involving music, written instructions, and a single sacrificed hen bought him enough time to escape alive. As dusk fell, the village filled with wandering dead, office workers, vendors, even children in school uniforms, and my mother named them softly through tears, while my father whispered that being alive at all was already mercy. We ate cold food, worked through the night, sealed animals into a soundproofed room, rotated watch shifts, conserved water and electricity, studied zombie behavior, and when water, power, and the internet finally died on the 5th day, the darkness felt complete. Only the radio hissed with static, broken occasionally by fragments of voices, reminders that somewhere beyond the walls, the world was still burning, still moving, still devouring itself, while we waited, silent and breathing, inside our fortress. After the repeated emergency broadcasts urging citizens to stay indoors and wait for rescue had looped so many times that their stiff official phrasing became etched into our minds, and with both the internet and television long since dead, time itself seemed to stretch unbearably, each day dragging past with a suffocating slowness that made it difficult to tell whether we were waiting for salvation or simply counting down to exhaustion. My mother passed those endless hours replaying the television dramas she had downloaded onto her tablet before everything collapsed, watching them again and again until she could recite entire scenes from memory, sometimes tugging me over to sit beside her and offering sharp, almost playful commentary, declaring that certain cunning characters would absolutely survive the apocalypse, while others would perish immediately, her voice light, but her eyes betraying how desperately she clung to this fragile sense of normalcy. My father, by contrast, poured all of his attention into fortifying our defenses, endlessly sharpening iron rods until they gleamed dully, winding steel wire along the courtyard walls with meticulous care, and patiently teaching us how to wield spears and long knives, how to dodge clumsy but violent zombie attacks, and how to keep our balance and composure in close combat, as though drilling soldiers for a battlefield that had come to our doorstep. Carl spent every day observing the zombies' behavior, carefully recording their movement patterns, reaction speeds, and weaknesses, inspecting every corner of the house for hidden dangers, and even launching the drone to scout the surrounding area, only to confirm that the number of zombies in the village was steadily increasing, and that the entrance had been completely sealed off by their wandering bodies, cutting us off from any possibility of escape. I took charge of the rooftop garden, and each morning when I saw new green shoots breaking through the soil, tender and stubborn, I felt a flicker of warmth in my chest, because in the choking darkness of the apocalypse, those fragile leaves were proof that life still insisted on continuing, quietly and without permission. On the night of the 14th day, it was my turn to stand guard, and holding a single candle, I patrolled the house slowly, checking every door and window, lingering especially long outside the master bedroom on the third floor, where the lack of installed security bars made the window latch the weakest point in the entire building. The candle flame trembled with every movement, shadows sliding along the walls, and the stairwell was so silent that the sound of my own heartbeat seemed deafening, echoing in my ears like a warning. After completing the inspection, I climbed the fifth-floor rooftop and sat there in a daze, surprised to find that the August night air, which should have been thick and oppressive, was instead wrapped in a thin mist that chilled me to the bone, while the sky glowed an unnatural blood red, faintly illuminating the rural paths below, where groups of zombies still wandered aimlessly, occasionally erupting into chaos when startled by birds, their howls rising and falling like a distorted tide. Fear had dulled over time, leaving behind a hollow calm, and I understood with unsettling clarity that if I wanted to survive, I would have to learn to coexist with days like these, because allowing terror to consume me would be the fastest way to die. A sudden rustling sound near the courtyard wall snapped me back to alertness, the unmistakable noise of something climbing, and my heart lurched violently as I tightened my grip on the small knife pressed against my palm. Peering down cautiously, I saw a dark figure crawling slowly along the top of the wall, and for one terrifying moment, I wondered if the zombies had somehow evolved the ability to climb. Holding my breath, I crept down to the second floor, pressed myself flat against the wall, and lifted a corner of the thick blackout curtain just enough to look outside, only for a pale face to appear directly in front of me without warning, its sunken cheeks and wide, desperate eyes framed by torn, filthy clothing smeared with blood and grime, the unmistakable look of someone who had not eaten in days. Instinctively, I raised the spear positioned by the window, ready to drive it through the bars, when the man suddenly spoke, his hoarse, trembling voice breaking into sobs as he begged me not to attack, insisting that he was human and not a monster. His feet slipped precariously among the metal spikes lining the wall, his body swaying as he clasped his hands together and pleaded for food, explaining through tears that there was a newborn baby at home who had not eaten in 3 days and would starve to death if he returned empty-handed. I froze, torn between instinct and reason, because 2 weeks had already passed, and families without supplies truly were being pushed to the brink. Yet the question gnawed at me relentlessly. How had he known we had food? And if I helped him now, would he return later with others, driven by hunger and desperation? In the apocalypse, kindness was often indistinguishable from suicide. And as I looked at his emaciated frame and trembling limbs, I knew that with a single push, I could send him falling into the waiting jaws below and end the problem forever. Carl's voice sounded behind me, calm but firm, and when I turned, I saw him and my parents standing in the doorway with weapons in hand, drawn by the noise. My mother stepped forward, her eyes soft with pity, and said quietly that we were all suffering and that the child was innocent, before returning with a can of formula and a small bundle of potatoes and sweet potatoes, passing them carefully through the bars, while warning the man to leave immediately and never return. He accepted the food with shaking hands, bowing repeatedly in gratitude as he whispered thanks and vanished into the darkness. And at the time I believed this was nothing more than a minor episode in the long nightmare, never imagining that such a small act of mercy would one day become our lifeline. By the 30th day after the outbreak, our stockpiled snacks were nearly gone, even hearty staples like potatoes and sweet potatoes dwindling rapidly, while meat had become a dangerous luxury, its smoke and aroma capable of drawing disaster, forcing us to cook it only occasionally, and late at night. After weeks of bland boiled vegetables, our mouths tasted perpetually bitter, our bodies thinner, and my mother often murmured her cravings for hot pot, braised pork, and dumplings like forbidden spells. That night, we finally gave in, sealing every door and window, turning on the range hood, and setting up the induction cooker, determined to enjoy one proper meal, with Carl bringing out frozen beef and lamb, me picking fresh greens from the rooftop, my mother unveiling her treasured hot pot base, and my father mixing dipping sauces with rare enthusiasm. The broth bubbled, steam carrying rich aromas through the room, and for a brief precious moment we forgot the apocalypse entirely, laughing and eating together as though the world outside had not already ended. Halfway through the meal, my mother went upstairs to harvest more greens, and moments later her scream tore through the house, sharp and terrified, sending us running toward the rooftop. Two burly men stood among the garden beds, their faces gaunt, but bodies strong, one bearing a vicious scar down his face and holding a knife against my mother's throat, blood already seeping, as grappling hooks and drones hung from the wall behind them, proof that we had been watched for a long time. I raised my hands and offered everything we had in exchange for my mother's life, but the scarred man only smiled greedily, tightening his grip and declaring that killing us would give him both the supplies and the house without complication. Carl spoke calmly, reasoning with him, pointing out that fighting us could still cost him his life, and after a tense pause, the man agreed to spare us, forcing us down the stairs and out the gate, where he shoved my mother forward and slammed the door shut behind us, mocking us as he claimed our home. Carl dragged us away, just in time, shouting that the noise had been deliberate. And moments later, a massive horde of zombies surged toward us, their rotten stench choking the air as we ran east toward an abandoned shoe factory. We fought desperately along the way, kicking, stabbing, and pushing through sheer will, until we finally burst inside the factory and barricaded the door with wire, furniture, and metal sheets, the pounding growing louder until the door began to warp. With no choice left, we retreated upward, climbing the rusted stairs to the rooftop, where we prepared makeshift weapons and armor from scraps, bracing ourselves as a thunderous crash echoed below, signaling that the door had finally been breached. The moment the bodies hit the floor below, the hoarse, rasping roars of the zombies and the shriek of metal scraping against metal fused into a single, unbearable cacophony that crawled up my spine and made my scalp prickle with raw terror, because there was no longer any doubt left to cling to. They were inside. From the first floor came the sound of dragging feet and disordered movement, low growls vibrating through the concrete like something alive and breathing beneath us. And although their steps were chaotic and uneven, the direction was unmistakable, drawing closer with every passing second until time itself felt frozen and suffocating. We pressed ourselves together at the third-floor stairwell, backs against cold walls, weapons clenched so tightly our hands ached, not daring to breathe too loudly because the silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears, each heartbeat stretching into pure torment as the howls echoed upward. Then, the footsteps grew heavier, thudding against the stairs with horrifying certainty, and I knew they had begun climbing. There was no door on the third floor, no place to retreat or barricade ourselves, and if we were seen now, death would not even bother to hesitate. Carl made his decision instantly, shouting that he would pry open the rooftop door and ordering us to hold the stairwell at all costs, before turning and charging upward, slamming his foot again and again against the rusted iron door until flakes of corrosion rained down and the metal finally groaned open into a narrow crack. The noise was like a signal flare, and the zombies surged upward in response, piling into the stairwell in a frenzy, trampling over those in front as they climbed over each other in a grotesque, living pyramid that crushed our flimsy barricade on the second floor in seconds. Dad, Mom, and I stood shoulder to shoulder at the third-floor landing, forming a human wall with our spears and rods, stabbing downward at every snarling head that appeared. But no matter how fast or how hard we struck, there were simply too many of them. Wave after wave, pressing forward without fear or fatigue. Several broke through at once, lunging blindly, and just as panic threatened to tear my control apart, Carl shouted for me to help from above, because although he had broken the lock, the rooftop door still refused to open, as if someone on the other side was bracing it shut. I sprinted upward, jammed my spear into the crack, and kicked with everything I had left, and the door finally burst open with a violent screech to reveal a gaunt, hostile man, clutching a wooden stick, eyes sharp with suspicion as he stared us down. Behind him stood a woman holding a bundled infant, and a tall young man who looked like their son, and recognition hit me all at once. It was the same man who had begged for food outside our house weeks earlier. I shouted until my throat burned, reminding him that my mother had given him formula and potatoes that night, that his baby would not have survived without them, and that we were not enemies, but desperate people with a horde of zombies at our backs. The pressure on the door faltered, hesitation flickering across their faces, and I seized the moment to shove it fully open, while Carl pushed my parents through, and drove his spear into a zombie's chest to jam the narrow stairwell and buy us precious seconds. I dragged my parents onto the rooftop and turned back just in time to see a one-armed zombie crash forward, skewered together with another on the sphere, the metal bending under their combined weight as Carl was knocked to the ground. The creature lunged for his neck with a mouth full of blood, and without thinking I seized a wooden spear and stabbed straight into its forehead, levering it aside as rotten flesh burst and sprayed, giving Carl enough time to scramble up and pull me onto the rooftop. The door slammed shut behind us and was immediately locked with a heavy iron chain, the clanging sound echoing harshly, while Carl half collapsed at the edge of the rooftop, panting and checking himself frantically for wounds or splashes of infected blood before finally pulling me into his arms. His body shook violently, and warm tears soaked into my hair. And in that moment I understood, with painful clarity, that even the strongest people were not immune to fear, and that in this ruined world, we were both each other's weakness and each other's only armor. The family behind the door truly was Mr. Taylor's, and over the next hours we learned how they had hidden on the rooftop for days, driven by guilt and gratitude, to press 2 shriveled sweet potatoes into our hands, precious beyond measure, saved from the food my mother had given them. We divided the potatoes between us, despite everyone's protests, each taking only a few bites, the meager food doing little more than soothe the sharpest edge of hunger. But it was enough to keep us standing. Mr. Taylor admitted awkwardly that he had seen our trucks arrive late at night before the outbreak fully exploded, that he had watched us reinforce the house and plant vegetables through binoculars, and that desperation for his infant had driven him to risk everything. The knowledge that we had been watched for so long made my skin crawl. Yet when I looked at the sleeping baby and his wife's arms, resentment felt hollow and pointless. Carl proposed cooperation, promising half the supplies once we reclaimed our house, in exchange for help dealing with the Scarface man and his accomplice. And Mr. Taylor and his son agreed without hesitation, their eagerness born not of greed, but of the simple desire to live. After several days of rest, Carl and my father returned with them to reclaim our home, and on the 38th night after the outbreak, Carl came back to me with exhaustion and joy woven into his voice, telling me we were finally home. The familiar walls, the supplies, the safety, and the loved ones around me broke something open inside my chest. And I cried until the past days of fear and wandering dissolved into nothing. True to his word, Carl gave Mr. Taylor's family their share, delivering most of it quietly by drone at night, joking darkly that if it fell, it would simply mean we no longer owed them anything. Below us, the Scarface man and his accomplice wandered among the zombies, stripped of arrogance and reduced to mindless corpses, and I held Carl tighter without saying a word, because survival in the apocalypse often demanded ruthlessness. Life slowly stabilized as the garden flourished, animals multiplied, water and power held steady, and zombies thinned out, until one thunderous day, helicopters roared overhead, and fire rained from the sky, cleansing the village in blazing waves of heat and light. By the 400th day, soldiers arrived, survivors were gathered, vaccines distributed, and the world, scarred and wounded, began to breathe again. Standing by an open window, as sunlight poured in and laughter filled the air, watching Carl cook hot pot without fear for the first time in over a year, I knew that more than 300 days of endurance had finally led us back to life. Countless sleepless nights, filled with fear and despair. Countless perilous moments brushing past death. All of it vanished in this instant, because we had endured the darkest of times and finally welcomed the dawn.